Hey, this is Amal from TechLeatherCraft. I want to take a moment to talk about a Tippmann 700 clicker press. I'll be dismantling it and changing the air bladder. So if you have any questions about it, you can see how it works. First thing you want to do is make sure the air supply is disconnected and you cycle through, make sure there's no air in there. Next, remove any leather, any cutting boards, any dies you may have in the middle. You don't want anything falling out. We're going to be unscrewing the top control box. It is held on by 1/8 hex screws. There's 4 of them, 2 on each side. You do want to unscrew these carefully. They are smaller screws. It doesn't take very much torque to actually get these unscrewed. Once you have them moved, you can lift up the controller box. You'll see that it is attached still by the hose. What you're going to do is to remove the hose, you're going to loosen up this clamp. You can use some flat nose pliers and just slowly walk the clamp back. Next, the hose is on there pretty tight. I ended up using a flathead screwdriver to kind of pry the rubber away from the metal fitting. In case you're wondering, this is how the connection works. You can see the air supply comes in through there and it travels all the way to the first switch, which you need to press, and then that air travels to the next switch, which you need to press, and then it goes into the clicker bladder. So I was working by myself. I do recommend having help if you can, but I was able to lift it back, and basically the idea here is to get all the weight distributed and tilted on to the C-clamp. You can see I'm actually holding it with one hand at certain points in the video. Because there's a wall on the back, I did need to flip it around so that the opening faced me. I did also swivel it on the C-clamp. Make sure you keep the hose pulled out of the way because you don't want the press coming down on the hose, putting a kink in there or a bend. You do want to be careful. I was working on a small surface table because it is the only stable, solid table I had. I do recommend working on a larger bench if you can. One thing you'll notice is that the press is angled downwards. I'll talk about how I worked on that. So you can see there's a little wood block underneath there. What I did find, it is still angled down, and basically when you unscrew that large metal box area, you don't want it to fall down and then kind of slide off the table. So just to level it up, I got a larger block of wood and lifted it up. I was trying to make it as level as possible, so when I do unscrew the metal plate from the C-clamp, if it falls down, it just falls flat straight down. You do want to make sure this is solid. If you do brace it with wood, make sure it's not going anywhere. Other thing I did was put a piece of fiberboard and a pillow or some cushioning so that when the plate did come loose, it would fall softly without damaging anything. The 3/8 hex bolts you need to loosen in the legs, and I'll show you how those work. I only had a 3/8 Allen wrench. My 3/8 hex wrench was really short. I couldn't get enough torque. I ended up using a wrench and basically using it as a breaker bar and kind of to get enough torque to loosen up the first couple turns. I did have to use a wrench a couple other times just as the pressure from the metal plate got onto the bolt. As I loosened the last bolt up, you can see that the plate just falls. Because I had built it up, it fell softly onto the pillow. Next, we're going to be removing these bolts, but to start, we're going to get onto a more safe surface. Now, I decided to put this on the floor, and I probably could have done this better, but I ended up dropping the board. It actually worked out fine because then I was able to just put it down flat on my floor. Now, these next 4 bolts here are what hold the 2 plates together. I did end up having to also use the wrench, kind of like a breaker bar. You do want to take note of these a little bit. These are the height adjustments for your cutting surface. So once we get this all assembled, you will need to adjust these bolts in quarter turn increments to make sure that your cutting surface is flat. These bolts you would adjust if you were changing dies, if your surface was cutting, or if your leather was cutting unevenly. These are the bolts you would be adjusting. So be careful with these. You don't want to strip them. They are really important. Although I'm sure you can get replacements from Tippmann if you do end up messing these up. Anyway, once the 4 bolts are out, you can now separate the movable plate and the back portion where the air hose is connected. You can see the air bladder is right there. I actually ended up peeling this off, and it peeled off really easily. I think part of the leak was in fact from the adhesive pad not adhering to the air bladder. One quick tip, if you want to check the air bladder, what I ended up doing was duct taping and sticking an air hose in there and testing it out, because you do want to check to see if it is the air bladder that is actually leaking or if it's just the adhesive section that has come loose and not allowing the air to stay put into the bladder. So you can spray some soap water on the air bladder and run some air in there and see if you see any bubbles or anything coming out. The next step, I ended up using kind of a large putty knife to try to scrape the adhesive pad off. It did come off alright. Trick here is you do want to get this off cleanly. And so what I ended up doing was, you can see I put a little duct tape in the hole right there, and I used some Goo Gone. You can use Goof Off or any adhesive remover type deal, and end up soaking it on a napkin and just kind of rubbing it into specifically the rubber pot that was still attached. I put about 1 or 2 coats on there and kind of let it sit for a minute and then started scraping. The longer you let it sit, the easier it will be to get the sticky residue off. I would recommend 1 or 2 coats and letting it sit for a minute or 2. Once I had the big chunks off, I did wipe it back down with some more adhesive remover just to get any extra residue off. And then after that, I used some all-in-one cleaner. You could use soap water, and wiped it all down just to get the adhesive remover off because it is kind of oily. And then after that, I did wipe it down with just a cloth. Make sure it is completely dry, that there's no liquid on here. Alright, so this is the old pad on the right and the new pad on the left. Here's the new adhesive sticker. I did check placement of it. Basically stick this on, make sure it is nice and centered. You want to get the air hole centered with the center cutout and get that down. I ended up pressing it down really good. You want to make sure it adheres nicely. Next, you want to line up your new bladder with the air hole that is in the center. I did end up taking like a white waxed pencil and just tracing the placement of it once I knew it was lined up. And so when it came time to actually remove the adhesive part on the top, I wouldn't have to worry about orienting or centering the air bladder. Once I had the air bladder down, I did pound on it, make sure it was nice and flat, press it down. I did leave it overnight, flipped back over so that the weight of the metal was pushing down on the air bladder. The next morning, I did then reattach the adjustment bolts that we removed earlier. You want to get these screwed on pretty tight, but you will have to do final adjustments once you have the clicker turned around. Since I was working by myself, I ended up kind of building up the level of the surface. So adding board, I ended up putting a cushion. Once you have built up, you can kind of pull up on the plate or on the edges and get the first bolt to attach or catch, and you should be good to go. Once you have the bolts in the legs tightened up, you're going to flip it back over. So once you have the press flipped over and you're going to connect the air hose, make sure you run it down the side, not down the middle. You can see in this, when I first put it on, it was running down the middle, and that is not right. You want it to actually lay on the side, like I'm showing the diagram here. Once you have it on the side, you can connect the air hose back into the control box. And I found walking the clamp back and forth onto the connector was the easiest way. You can just screw on and tighten the control box. So here are the adjustment screws that I talked about. You will want to adjust those in quarter turn increments. Make sure that your surface is level and that your dies are cutting cleanly through the leather or material you're using. So you might have to play with those. Test it out, some scrap pieces if you want. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. If you want to check out Tippmann's website and also the YouTube channel, they have some really cool videos showing the Tippmann 700 and the 1500, cutting multiple dies, multiple examples of it. You can always give them a call. I did call them several times when I was wondering about changing out the air bladder. They're really helpful over there, and so don't be afraid to give them a call. Thanks for watching. Take care. I'll see you next time.